to language acquisition and learning. So for these theories, what we'll be discussing are as follows. So we'll be classifying them into four groups, which are the behaviorist and the innateness, innativist, the cognitive, and input or social interactionist theory. So here, just to give you a brief central idea of these four theories that we'll be focusing, we have on the behaviorist theory, children imitate adults. Their correct adherences are enforced when they get what they want or are praised. So we'll be dealing with them further as we go through with our discussion. And the theories that we'll be focusing here is the theory of B.F. Skinner. And of course, you are already particular with Chomsky, si Noam Chomsky, and the central idea of his theory pertaining to innateness and nativist. So we'll be identifying why is it called innateness or nativist. Since our focus here is more of a child's brain contains special language learning mechanisms at birth, which is similar to what we discussed when we are discussing about the universal grammar. Okay, then of course we have PJ, familiar name to you. We'll be tackling PJ's cognitive theory, which is the central idea of the discussion focuses on that language is just one aspect of a child's overall intellectual development. And finally, we have Brunner. I'm sure you have already encountered the name Brunner. And the theory that we'll be focusing on about Brunner is the input or social interactionist theory. So this theory emphasizes the interaction between children and their caregiver. So this slide alone will give you a brief idea of those theories that we'll be tackling as far as the child development is concerned and how these child development theories are related to language learning and language acquisition. And we'll be tackling as well some of the limitations of the theory and some of the opposition or contradicting ideas that were opposed by others with regard to this theory. Okay, so let's have first behaviorism theory. If there's one thing that you really need to take into account when you heard of the word behaviorism theory, it has always something to do with the environment. Okay? Kapag pinag-usapan yung behaviorism, it's always has something to do with the environment. How does the environment affects one's development? The kind of environment where the child grows. Let's say, for instance, the kind of language where the child was exposed to has something to do with child's language acquisition, and the kind of environment where where the child learns to speak the specific language because it was taught by the teacher. So the child will be able to adapt it. So when we talk of behaviorism theory, we are actually pertaining to the to the environment. Okay. So B.F. Skinner suggested that a child imitates the language of its parents or carers. Since we have mentioned a while ago that in behaviorism, we are after with the environment. So whatever the child sees, whatever the child observes around his or her environment, the child will try to imitate. If we are after with the language, the child will also imitate how the language of the parents or the carers. When we talk of carers, we're pertaining to the caregivers, people who are raising the child. They're let's say for instance they're guardians. Okay, successful attempts are rewarded because an adult who recognizes a word spoken by child will praise the child and or give it what it is asking for. So successful appearances are therefore reinforced, while unsuccessful ones are forgotten. So if we're just going only to take note of what this statement refers to, is that um, a child is a child is um, has the opportunity to learn if, let's say for instance, if an adult is actually knowledgeable of that specific language. Although, if we're just going to look at or to observe among Filipinos, di ba, although we Filipinos are speaking the Filipino language, there are many times that we are not using the language properly. Am I right? It's the same way with how the Americans use their own language, the English language. And we can actually observe that even them, they are using the language incorrectly. So if a child grows in an environment wherein the parents are really fluent in English, then the child has this opportunity to gain more about speaking the right language, following the right grammar or the correct grammar. Kaya sinabi dyan, if an adult is good at on utilizing or using that specific language, so he will be rewarded. The reward there is that the child will be able to get the right knowledge that he has to learn when it comes to learning that language. However, behaviorism has actually a limitations. So, sabi rito, while there must be some truth in Skinner's explanation, there are many objections to it. Okay? Again, when we talk of behaviorism, it has always something to do with the kind of environment where the child was exposed to. Okay? Let's have the first limitation. So language is based on a set of structures or rules which could not be worked out simply by imitating individual utterances. The mistake made by children revealed that they are not simply imitating but actively working out and applying rules. So this is now the challenge when it comes to behaviorism. Let's say, for example, when we were a child, we were taught that if you would like to change a verb, let's say from present tense to past tense, we were taught by our teacher that you have to add D and ED, even when you are studying subject-verb agreement. Diba? If it is singular, if the verb is singular, we add S. If the verb is plural, we don't add S. Diba? Or in pronoun, we add S if a word is no. If it is a noun, pertaining to a noun, we add S if a noun is plural. And we don't add S if it is singular. So, halimbawa, if a child is stick on the rule that um, we add S for a plural verb, a plural noun, any noun, lalagyan nila ng S. Let's say, child. Sasabihin nila, childs. Kasi sabi ng teacher ko, kapag plural daw, we add S. Kasi flower, flowers. Pen, pens. Egg, eggs. Tama nga naman yung bata. Pero not all nouns is ganun ang ina-apply. So, ang child, are we going to add S? Childs. That's now the problem or the limitations of behaviorism because the child has this tendency to over-apply it. Yun yung sinasabi nila rito. Katulad yung example nga natin dito that a child who says drink is the past tense. Kasi sabi sa rule, if a verb is a present tense and then you have to change that to past tense, we just have to add D or ED, which sounds like at the end. So, ang drink, ang past tense niya, drinked, which is not the correct past form of the verb drink. It has to be drank, diba? So that is now the challenge among you English teachers. How are you going to explain that to a child, considering that we have these specific rules that they have to follow? So as far as language teaching is concerned, how are you going to teach them this kind of limitations or this kind of exemption to the rules when it comes to the language? Diba? That's the challenge among us English teachers. That's why in my case, I'm not really good at teaching elementary students. Okay, so mas maidali sa akin na magturo sa college students because how are you going to simplify it? Well, anyway, The good thing about it is that the curriculum now in language teaching, English language teaching, is that iniutay-utay naman nila, 'di ba? So iniunti-unti na lang ini-introduce sa mga bata. It's just that kasi nga we have the so-called behaviorist theory that wherein whatever the child learns, they will be adapting it, and there is this tendency that they will be over applying it. Just like in our example here. Okay? So sabi rito, such forms are often referred to as intelligent mistakes or virtuous errors. Virtuous errors naman daw siya. Kasi nga naman, at least we can take note of that na okay, the child learned something from the teacher. That's why the child was able to apply that kind of rule that you just add S for plural noun and S for plural for singular verb. They were able to do that and add D or ED for past tense of the verb. But again, not all words have the same um, not all words have the same application of the principle. That's why again we have the always the so-called exception in grammar. Okay, so that's now the the challenge, especially if you're teaching elementary students. Okay, I I believe that most of the college students are able to grasp this kind of basic rules. Next, another limitation of behaviorism is that the vast majority of children goes through the same stages of language acquisition. Okay, we cannot tell that what is experienced by a child is similar to what had experienced by another child. Do the children have the same learning experience or learning exposure? Do children have the same language acquisition? Okay, can behaviorism is will be able to explain to us that kind of differences? Not all children can be affected by the kind of environment where they grow up. But behaviorism argued that, again, behaviorism argued that the kind of environment where you are exposed to will actually affect your language acquisition. However, it does not always apply to all. One basic example for that is I forgot the name of this child. Okay, I forgot the name of this person, but I read that in Facebook, and it's not a fake news. Okay, so this child was born in a prison. He was born in prison kasi yung nanay at tatay niya, ay yung nanay tsaka lola niya doon nakatira. So doon kumbaga, lumaki siya sa isang environment na kung saan nandun yung mga magugulong tao. Okay? Nandun siya sa correction. Pero hindi nakaapekto yon para ang isang bata ay matuto. Hindi porke lumaki siya doon sa isang lugar na sinasabi nating magulo, ay malaki ang epekto dun sa bata. Because the child has a different environment aside from the prison where he grew up. Doon talaga siya lumaki hanggang sa siya ay makagraduate ng kolehiyo. Doon na siya. The child has a different environment. Kumbaga, dun sa the other environment where he was exposed to is yung eskwelahan. Okay? So, hindi dahil madalas siya doon sa prison, ma-acquire niya na lahat kung ano man yung mga bad habits na nandoon sa kulungan. No. He's different. Okay? So, it's not always the case, diba? So apart from certain extreme cases, the sequence seems to be largely unaffected by the treatment the child receives or the type of society in which he or she grows up. Just like what I mentioned to you a while ago. So, may mga bata na lumaki sa magulong pamilya. May mga bata na lumaki na ang magulang ay palamura. Pero kung titingnan natin sila, hindi naman nila na-adapt yung pagiging palamura, hindi naman nila na-adapt yung lengguwahe ng pananalita ng kanilang mga magulang. Bakit? Dahil yung bata ay may iba pang environment na kung saan siya ay exposed. Kumbaga, nagkakaroon ngayon ng contrasting environment where the child has this tendency to choose Papa-apekto ba ako o hindi? So that's one of the limitations of behaviorism. Okay? Kasi we are always looking at na kung saan madalas expose yung bata, ganun din siya. That's why I do not believe on tell me who your friends are and I will tell you who you are. I do not believe on that saying because I have a friend, mga kaibigan ko, mga loko-loko, pero ako ay mabait. May mga ganun, di ba? Mga barumbadong mga kaibigan, pero mabait. May anong mabait. So, it's not always the case. Okay, so ito yung isa sa mga um, contradicting statement na tinitingnan din when it comes to behaviorism. But at some points, we can actually see, di ba? So, basahin natin yung sinabi ni Gabriel. Oops, okay. Yes, Gabriel suggests he agrees po. Sometimes they're the ones who corrected us if we say something wrong. Tama, yes. Oo, di ba yung mga bata? Sila pa yung nagpo-correct sa atin minsan. Ayan. Okay? And so sabi naman, friends differ in personality. Siguro factor din talaga, no? Yung personality natin. Tama yung point din ni Aloba that personality can also be a reason. Diba? If the kind of personality that you have may not be affected by the first environment, by the initial environment where you are exposed to. It could be other environment is affecting you. That's why you weren't able to acquire kung ano man yung environment na yun. Halimbawa, sinasabi 'di ba, ang mga magulang mo halos lahat ay ang mga tao sa paligid mo sa pamilya ninyo ay mga achievers, mga magagaling. Bakit tanging ikaw lang ang hindi at hirap na hirap kang matuto? Okay? Baka merong deficiency sa learning, baka wala talaga yung interest niya sa pag-aaral, o baka hindi lang talaga yun yung hilig niya. So kaya ibang-iba siya sa kanyang mga kapatid. So ba sumpa po siya. Di naman. Okay? So another limitation. Children are often unable to repeat what an adult says, especially if the adult utterance contains a structure the child has not yet started to use. Okay? So how is this even possible? Halimbawa. So the structure in question here involves negating verbs. So if a child is not actually exposed or usually exposed on that kind of, let's say, structure of sentence, hindi siya ganun ka-exposed doon. So halimbawa, child, nobody don't like me. The mother correct the child. No, say, nobody likes me. Child, nobody don't like me. Paulit-ulit na sinasabi ng nanay na it should be nobody likes me. Nobody likes me. Sabi ng mother, no, now listen carefully. Say, nobody likes me. Then the child said, oh, nobody don't likes nobody don't likes me. How is this even possible? So balikan natin yung sinabi rito ng limitation. So children are often unable to repeat what an adult says, especially if the adult utterance contains a structure the child has not yet started to use. In short, kapag binibigla natin yung mga bata doon sa isang struktura ng pangungusap or structure of sentence wherein it is quite difficult for them to absorb it kasi hindi naman lagi nilang kahit paulit-ulitin natin yun in a day kung hindi naman talaga sila totally exposed on that. Bakit may mga bata na hindi pa rin nila ma-absorb yun? Kahit pa ulit-ulit na nating sinasabi sa kanila. Eh sabi nga 'di ba ng behaviorism, kung saan environment ka exposed, kung environment exposed ka ay lagi kang kinokorek, bakit pa ulit-ulit mo pa rin ginagawa ang parehong pagkakamali? Why are you always committing the same mistake? 'Di ba? Parang linya sa pelikula 'yon. Always committing the same mistake. No matter how many times you correct the child is still always committing the same mistake. Why? Behaviorism cannot explain that. Kasi nga sila more of the effect of the environment. Hindi kayang explain ng behaviorist yun. Bakit gano'n yung bata? Di ba? So, kaya nagkaroon ng limitation on that matter. Okay? Next. Another limitation. Few children receive much explicit grammatical correction. Parents are more interested in politeness and truthfulness. Okay? Totoo yan. Ang ibang mga magulang, kahit na pamali-mali yung kanilang grammar, but what they are after with is that maayos yung pagsasalita ng bata, or basta the more what is important is the content of what the child is saying, and they will be just tolerating it. Okay? If a child commits mistake, let's say for instance, doon sa kanyang sinabi, let's say mali yung kanyang grammar, halimbawa sinabi niya, mama penge, gatas, mama, or let's say for instance, ganun yung sinabi ng bata, which is going to listen to it, it's actually, they're incorrect. But penge, should be pahingi po ng gatas. Okay? So, on that matter alone, the parents are not actually providing an explicit grammatical correction because the parent is after with the content. Okay? They are after with the content of what the child is saying. And sabi nila, kasi ang thinking ng mga magulang is that bata pa naman yan eh. Kaya siguro they don't mind kung pamali-mali yung kanyang pagsasalita. That's why if you have a brother or a sister na bata sa inyo, as much as possible, wag niyo sila ng bolol. Ako naniniwala ako doon, if you talk to them ng pabolol, halimbawa, I forgot the term, I forgot the word, but there are some instances, di ba, when we are trying to cuddle our sister, and then we often say na pabolol sa kanila, di ba? We do that kahit mga nasa 2 or 3 years old na, di ba? So, thank you, baby talk. Okay? When you do often use baby talk to them, yung pabebe, tawagin natin sa salitang balbal, di ba? Ma-absorb ng mga bata yun. Okay? So, we're tolerating it. But what we're focusing on this limitation is that few children receive much explicit grammatical correction. Why? Sabi ni Brown, ni Kasten, tsaka ni Bellugi, it seems to be truth value rather than well-formed syntax. Truth value. When we talk of truth value, the essence of what the child is telling us, the essence, the meaning or the content or the context of what they're saying, rather than well-formed syntax. Okay? That chiefly governs explicit verbal reinforcement by parents. Wherein, sabi rito, which renders mildly paradoxical the fact that the usual product of such a training schedule is an adult whose speech is highly grammatical but not notably truthful. Okay? So, there has to be a verbal reinforcement among parents. An explicit verbal reinforcement among parents. Okay? But behaviorism is limited on expanding explanation on this one when we're pertaining to explicit grammatical correction. Okay? So, there is an evidence for a critical period for language acquisition. Sabi, children who have not acquired language by the age of about 7 will never entirely catch up. Okay, yun is sa hindi to kayang ipaliwanag ng behaviorism. Why is it that there are children who are at the age of 7 who could not catch up with acquiring a specific language? Bakit di sila makapag-catch up para 7 years old sila? 'Di ba? Sabi nga 'di ba nasa cognitive theory that ni Piaget that when a child reach the age of 7, they have already started the maturity of their brain, and they will now be able to to do things on their own, to think on their own, even with the less guidance coming from their guardians. Pero may mga cases daw, may mga cases daw wherein children who have not acquired language by the age of about 7 will never entirely catch up. So meron ditong example. So the most famous example is that of Genie, discovered in 1970 at the age of 13. So si Genie kasi I'm not very much particular of the whole story of Genie, pero si Genie ay parang uh, hindi siya exposed sa tao for until she reaches 13 years old. So she had been severely neglected, brought up in isolation, and deprived of normal human contact. Of course, she was disturbed and underdeveloped in many ways. During subsequent attempts at rehabilitation, her carers tried to teach her to speak. Despite some success, mainly in learning vocabulary, she never became a fluent speaker, failing to acquire the grammatical competence of the average 5-year-old. Now, can behaviorism explain this? Kaya bang ipaliwanag ng behaviorism ang ganitong uri ng critical period of language acquisition? 13 years old on understanding. Okay, that's now the argument that they are posing as far as behaviorism is concerned. Okay, next. Oops. Now, those are the basic concepts that we have to take into account when it comes to behaviorism. Again, when we talk of behaviorism, it has always something to do with the kind of environment. However, there are some limitations that restrict to explain to us some of the scenarios, some of the situations, some of the phenomena that will explain to that cannot be explored by mere utilizing the said theory on behaviorism. And now we will move on to innateness and nativist theory. And of course, one of the very famous linguists who has this stand to discuss or to explore this kind of discussion about nativity is no other than Noam Chomsky. Okay, Noam Chomsky published a criticism of the behaviorist theory in 1957. In addition to some of the argument listed a while ago, he focused particularly on the impoverished language input that the children receive. So adults do not typically speak in grammatically complete sentences. In addition, what the child hears is only a small sample of language. So let's now discuss why is it that Noam Chomsky focused on the impoverished language input. Okay, so as mentioned in our previous discussion, Noam Chomsky had developed the theory, universal grammar theory, wherein in his theory, he said that, ito yung sinabi niya rin yan the children have an inborn faculty for language acquisition. So the theory that he proposes suggested that it is biologically determined. So since we have a brain, our brain has this capacity to store memories, to store information, and the memory that we are using or the information that is stored in our brain will be utilized in our language learning and our language acquisition. But I think our left brain has something to do with our language. If our left brain is affected, our linguistic our way of speaking can also be affected. Yung language natin will be affected. Okay? So sinasabi ni Noam Chomsky na ang tao ay natural na sa tao na meron niyang kakayanan na umunawa ng language, may kakayanan niyang umunawa ng isang gramatika. Kaya nga lang ay kailangan na mayroong magti-trigger. Kaya nga sabi niya rito, the human species has evolved a brain whose neural circuits contain linguistic information at birth. So nandiyan na yan sa utak natin. Nasa kokote na natin yung kakayahan nating umunawa ng information, even at birth. Okay? So this is now the term that Chomsky proposed, the language acquisition device. So ano tong language acquisition device that is always mentioned when we are talking of language acquisition, especially during Prussian's discussion. If you will be discussing Prussian, so Prussian will be discussing the LAD. So based on Chomsky's view. So the child's natural predisposition to learn language is triggered by hearing. Hearing speech, and the child's brain is able to interpret what he or she hears. So, yung mga bata daw, kahit tayo nagsasalita, kumbaga, they have this natural capability to get that information in their brain. It's just that they cannot verbalize it, pero kapag sinasabi natin yan, na-store na raw sa utak natin. I am not so sure up to which age are you, how young are you, kung ano yung last na natatandaan nyo ng bata kayo, I'm not so sure. But in my case, the only childhood memory that I remember was when I was 6 years old. Beyond that, I cannot remember anything. I cannot remember my childhood beyond 6 years old. But from 6 years old, I still have my vivid memory of those things that I had experienced. Okay? So, pero sabi ni Chomsky, naka-store na raw yan sa utak natin eh. But in my case, I cannot remember anything when I was beyond 6 years old. Okay? So Chomsky did not suggest that an English child is born knowing anything specific about English. Ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo nung nakaraang semester when we discuss about about language, di ba? Hindi porke ang magulang mo at both your parents or let's say American, pagkapanganak mo pa lang, parang natural na sa iyo na magsasalita ka ng Ingles. What if pinanganak ka sa Amerika, parehong Amerikano at Amerikana ang parents mo, pero lumaki ka sa Pilipinas na kung saan ang salitang ginagamit ay Filipino. So Filipino ang gagamitin mong lengguwahe. Dahil doon, yun yung nagsilbing first language mo. So, kaya sinabi niya dyan, he did not suggest that an English child is born knowing anything specific about English, of course. Although he is saying to us that a child has this natural ability, linguistic ability at the time of birth. He stated that all human languages share common principles. And that principles that Noam Chomsky is pertaining to is the grammar, the principles of let's say the syntax rules. Okay, it is the child's task to establish how the specific language he or she hears expresses these underlying principles. Yung sinasabi kasi ni Chomsky, yung kakayahan ng bata na mag-organize ng thoughts and ideas. Let's say, kahit pa hindi ganun ka-perfect ang kanyang syntax, nung sinarinig niya yung mama, papa, gusto ko dede, gusto ko gatas. Paano na pagtagni-tagni ng bata yun? Okay? Paano yung napagtagni-tagni yun? Meaning to say, yung bata has this ability to mix those words. Although, if we're just going to be particular of the syntax, it does not follow the correct syntax. Hindi niya sinusunod yung tamang grammar. But if we're just going to look at it, how is it that the child was able to merge all those terms and the context is there? Because the child wants a milk. Mama, papa, gusto ko gatas. Paano niya nagawang buuhin yun? Diba? Hindi naman siya kinakausap ng magulang niya na laging sinasabi na, anak, sabihin mo, mama, gusto ko gatas. Di naman sinasabi na magulang yun. Pero yung napapakinggan ng bata, siguro. Okay? Siguro, ginawa ng nanay is, anak, ito na yung gatas galing kay mama. And from that, we don't know what's happening inside the brain of the child. Again, this is only just a theory. But based on observation in Noam Chomsky, why is it that the child was able to express or was able to construct that kind of sentence, although it's a broken syntax? Okay? Napagtagni-tagni niya. So meaning to say, if that will be the case, there's a tendency nga that the child has this ability to organize thoughts and ideas. It may not be as perfect as a grammar. Yun naman sinasabi ni Chomsky. It may not be as perfect as grammar syntax. The good thing about it is that papaano na pagtagni-tagni ng bata yung mga salitang yun to come up with a context. Okay? Now that's the mystery of the world, the mystery of the brain that we cannot totally understand why. 'Di ba? Or kaya ba nating butasan ng utak ng bata, 'di ba? I'm sure that you also observe that kind of behavior among your young siblings or among other child na nakikita nyo mga 3 or 4 years old. Okay? So, yun yung naman gustong sabihin ni Noam Chomsky when he mentioned of language acquisition device. That um, learning a language is triggered by hearing speech. Naripapakinggan lang nila pero napapagtagni-tagni nila, and the child's brain is able to interpret what he or she hears according to the underlying principle or structures it already contains. So, di ba, that's the mystery that is observed among the child. Even us cannot explain that, but that's the observation of Chomsky. Okay, let's I think Alaba would like to say something. Alaba, yes, do so.
Ay, sorry po. Siguro po isa na po dun yung factor is yung perception, tapos yung senses po nila. Dahil po yung katulad po ng sinasabi nyo na pagtatagpi-tagpi, nakikita po nila yung parang in-act out ng parent nila, tapos po yung specific word regarding that act, tapos po nakakabuo sila ng idea regarding that. Kaya po sila nakakapag-produce ng salita po, gano'n.
Yes, very good, Alaban. Nice observation yun. Parang ganun nga yung ano natin, di ba? Kaya nakaka-impress. Pero again, this is only just based on theory. Again, pag sinabi ng theory, it does not always apply to all situations. Okay? Another one, let's have this example. For example, the language acquisition device already contains the concept of verb tense. Let's say a child has already a concept of what a verb tense is. So, by listening to such forms as work, played, and tatted, the child will form the hypothesis that the past tense of verb is formed by adding the sound of d, t, or ed, or id to the base form of the verb. This in turn will lead to the virtuous errors mentioned above. It hardly needs saying that the process is unconscious. Parang yung nangyari din dun sa hindi kayang ipaliwanag noong behaviorism na I think LAD or no, Chomsky's theory can suffice what cannot be sufficed by behaviorist theory. Pag sasabungin natin yung dalawang teorya na kaya siguro yung hindi mapaliwanag from the standpoint of behaviorism, kayang ipaliwanag ng view ni Chomsky na dahil nga yung bata kaya ganun siya mag-isip kasi because of the LAD, the language acquisition device. Na pag sinabi na language acquisition device, ito yung pagtitrigger natin para yung isang bata ay may makuha yung nais mong ipunto sa kanila. Kumbaga yung bata mismo, yung kanilang utak, yung kanilang brain has this capacity to understand things that is limited on explanation based on behaviorist point of view. So this in turn, again, lead to the virtuous errors. So some evidence that support the innateness theory. So we have the first one is from Slobin. So Slobin has pointed out that human anatomy is peculiarly adapted to the production of speech. Neuroscience has also identified specific areas of the brain with distinctly linguistic functions. Totoo yan, di ba? There's a part of our brain that is actually used for our linguistic functions. If that particular brain will be affected, our speech will also be affected. Okay? Another one, the formation of Creole varieties of English appears to be the result of the LAD at work. Last semester, we discussed about the difference between a Creole and a Pidgin, wherein a Pidgin, it's just that in order for them to converse, they were just forced to speak that particular language hanggang sa ma-adapt na nila ng ma-adapt yung particular language na yon, and once they adapt that particular language, that gave birth to a Creole. Naging language na nila. Okay? So, halimbawa, so the linguist Derek Beckerton has studied the formation of Dutch-based Creoles in Suriname. So, sino yung pinag-aralan niya? So, pinag-aralan niya yung mga escaped slaves living together but originally from different language groups. So, these slaves are talking different languages. They come from a different countries, and they were on that particular area wherein they cannot understand each other because they're speaking a different language. How can they understand? Since they are um, a specific group wherein mayroong mga nagsasalita ng Dutch, they were forced to communicate in their very limited Dutch. The result was the restricted form of language known as a pidgin. Okay? The adult speakers were past the critical age at which they could learn a new language fluently. They had learned Dutch or Dutch as a foreign language and under unfavorable conditions. So, dito nagkaroon ng language acquisition. So, kumbaga, kayang i-process ng kanilang brain yung kanilang mga naririnig coming from other people. They're able to speak Dutch kahit pa sabihin natin that's not their native language. Kumbaga, naging native language nila yun kasi they have no choice. If they really would like to get along with them, they need to speak that particular language. So, since they were forced, ayun, na-adapt na nila. So, hanggang sa magkaroon nga ng Creole. Okay? I think dito sa atin sa Philippines, yung Chabacano can be considered as, kasi mix na yun ng Spanish eh. It's not a pure Spanish, but if you're just going to listen to them, it sounds like more of a Spanish. So yung Chabacano, okay, sa Zamboanga. So, ganun din yung nangyari sa kanila since we all know that the Philippines is colonized by the Spaniards. It's just that I'm not very much particular of the historical context why they still continued with speaking Spanish while the rest of the parts of the Philippines utilize different dialects. Okay, as here in the province of Rizal, we used Tagalog. Okay, so but in the case of Chabacano, generally, parang pagpakikinggan mo, they are speaking Spanish because that can be understood, because that is understandable because we were once colonized by the Americas. But now the question is, why is it that they still have that kind of language, the language that was influenced by the Spaniards, diba? Imagine if we are all speaking Spanish. Another evidence to support the innateness theory. Okay, so ngayon, bakit naging innateness dito sa sinasabi sa unang paliwanag natin? Kasi nga, the ability to acquire knowledge or to acquire language is there already. Yung may nagtitrigger sa kanila in order for them to learn that specific language. Okay, the next, studies of the sign languages used by the deaf have shown that far from being crude gestures replacing spoken words, these are complex, fully grammatical languages in their own right. So although just like what I mentioned to you previously, that when we talk of language, we're not only pertaining to spoken words, we are also pertaining to gestures. So as far as the sign languages is concerned, these people who are using sign languages, they are able to come up with their own way of expressing their thoughts and ideas in a form of a sign language, which is still a language. Okay, so however, a sign language may exist in several dialects. Totoo yan. Iba yung pag Tagalog or pag Filipino, iba yung sign language. Kapag English na iiba din. So, children learning to sign as a first language pass through similar stages to hearing children learning spoken language. The ability of these people to acquire on how to use sign languages is the same way with how we acquire language when we are speaking. It is the same processing that happens inside their brain. The same process when we are speaking is similar with how they process their brain in order for them to learn the sign languages. So pareha lang na proseso ang nangyayari. Kahit tayo pa salita at sila pa sign language, it's still the same process. It is still the same language acquisition device that they are utilizing. Hence, that supports now the idea of innateness theory na nature na nasa utak ng tao ang magproseso ng language at unawain ang tamang paggamit nito, which is the LAD nga. Okay. However, not all theories are perfect. Chomsky's theory has also some limitation. First, Chomsky's work on language was theoretical, as already given. He was interested in grammar, and much of his work consists of complex explanations of grammatical rules. So he did not study real children. So this is now the concern with Chomsky. So while others are using experiment, let's say for some are using, let's say, animals in order for them to study one's behavior, just like B.F. Skinner, gumamit siya ng hayop in order for them to understand behavior. But Chomsky did not use real children in explaining his concept. So the theory relies on children being exposed to language, but takes no account of the interaction between children and their carers or their caregivers. So nor does it recognize the reasons why a child might want to speak the functions of language. So this is now the concern with Chomsky. He did not use the real children to understand how the children think. Okay, so again, that's the concept of Chomsky. Balikan natin to simplify it. When we talk of Chomsky, he only simply would like to tell us that the child or human has this ability to recognize language and to understand language because human has a brain that he or she utilizes in order for him to process things. In the same manner with how human processes the language. Then we have cognitive theory, to which you are all particular with. Then we have Piaget's cognitive theory, which states that children's language reflects the development of their logical thinking and reasoning skills in stages, with each period having a specific name and age reference. So, na-discuss naman natin ito. Pasadahan lang natin what are these 4 stages. Let's say sensory motor period, pre-operational period, egocentrism, and operational period. So these are the stages where the child underwent as far as the child's development. Okay, di na natin isa-isa niya kasi we have already discussed all these 4 stages. So Piaget argued that a child has to understand a concept before he or she can acquire the particular language form which expresses the concept. Well, if we're just going to look at from Chomsky's point of view, di ba sabi ni Chomsky, from the very beginning, the child has this ability to organize thoughts and ideas based on some of the examples that we mentioned a while ago. Pero sabi ni PJ, no, it does not always follow because the child has to follow a certain stages. And from that stage, the child has to learn a specific thing. So let's say from sensory motor stage, di ba, when we talk of sensory motor stage, from the term sensory, the child is only just grasping what is perceived by his or her senses. Okay? Kaya nga, di ba, nakaka-recognize siya ng light, nakaka-recognize siya ng sound, ng smell, ng taste. So, sensory motor stage pa lang yung child doon. Until such time na umabot nga siya dun sa last stage. Pero, kay Chomsky, ang focus niya lang naman, ang gusto niya lang naman sabihin, di ba, is that, okay, yung bata, given na sa kanya yung kakayahan niyang umunawa. Given na. Pero si PJ, hindi. Merong stages na dapat tayong tingnan. The same stages that can also be observed as far as how a child can learn a specific language. For example, sabi niya rito, there will be a point in a child's intellectual development when he or she can compare objects with respect to size. This means that if you gave the child a number of sticks, he or she could arrange them in order of size. Kasi nga, ano yung unang tumatak sa bata? Ang unang tumatak sa bata ay ang pag-arrange ng object according sa size. So, ngayon, pag binigyan mo siya ng object, kahit hindi mo siya sabihin na ayusin mo yan according sa size. Ang gagawin ng bata, i-arrange niya yan according sa size. Even you not telling the child to do it so. Why? Because nandun yung preconceived thoughts niya na ang idea niya is about when you are arranging things, it should be in order of size. Kumbaga yung nakatak sa utak ng bata. So, anong ibig sabihin nito kay PJ? Kasi si PJ nag-experiment talaga siya. Gumamit talaga siya ng mga bata na inoobserbahan niya. Kaya doon sa kanyang observation, doon niya nabuo yung different stages. Hindi siya yung basta nalaman nag-craft ng isang teorya based on random observation. So what he did was, he really did an experimentation. So kaya sabi niya, PJ suggests, kasi siya, ang ginawa niya talaga, nagpalaro siya eh. What I mean nagpalaro is that, binigyan niya ng mga activities sa mga bata, different ages, hanggang sa makabuo siya ngayon ng kanyang konkretong analysis as to the development of the child. So, it is the same manner din daw when we are looking at the development of language sa mga bata. So, KJ suggested that a child who had not yet reached this stage would not be able to learn and use comparative adjectives like bigger or smaller. Okay. Another phenomenon that is observed, kasi nga si PJ nag-experiment siya. Binigyan niya ng mga laruan yung mga bata, okay, doon niya na-conceive yung term na object permanence. So, object permanence is another phenomenon often cited in relation to the cognitive theory. So, during the first year of life, children seem unaware of the existence of objects they cannot see. Kasi nga sa sensory motor stage, whatever perceived by the senses. Pag hindi niya na-perceive yung isang object na yon, hindi niya kilala yon. Okay? And an object which moves out of sight ceases to exist. By the time they reach the age of 18 months, children have realized that objects have an existence independently of their perception, just like what I mentioned to you. So the cognitive theory draws attention to the large increase in children's vocabulary at around this age, suggesting a link between object permanence and the learning of labels for objects. So basic lang gustong sabihin dito ni PJ. So if a certain object is not perceived by the senses of a child, he or she will not be able to realize that object unless otherwise na-perceive niya yun. So it's very important on part of the child. Now, how are we going to relate that phenomenon in terms of language? If a child did not hear that particular language, hindi niya yon ma-acquire. Unless otherwise, lagi at lagi niyang naririnig ang salitang iyon. Okay? So, yun yung implications noon sa language acquisition. So, kumbaga kung sa object na hindi niya madalas makita, hindi niya ma-recognize. It's the same true with if a specific language is not always heard by the child, it will be difficult for a child to acquire that specific language. Kaya nga, di ba, whatever the child hears, yun ang gagamitin niya. So on that aspect, we can really see, parang may touch of Noam Chomsky doon sa sinabi niya, di ba? Okay, so limitations of the cognitive theory. Ito naman yung limitations niya. During the first year to 18 months, I think that is 1 year old, 1.5 year old, di ba? Connections of the type explained a while ago are possible to trace, but as a child continues to develop, so it becomes harder to find clear links between language and intellect. Kasi nga, it does not always follow na habang tumatanda yung bata, mas tumatalino. Kaya, bakit si 2 years old na ibang husay sa pagsasalita ng English, 3 years old? Bakit itong si ay 10 years old na, hindi pa rin nakapagsalita ng English naman straight? Bakit itong batang to 7 years old, ang husay gusto na mag-English? Bakit itong batang ito, let's say, college student na, barok pa rin mag-English? So, yun naman yung isa sa mga limitasyon. How are you going to reconcile the concern? Diba? Kung sinasabi ni PJ na as the child grows up, mas nagmamature ang utak, mas napapadali ang language acquisition. But the question is, bakit itong college student na to hirap pa rin sa paggamit ng English? Mas mahusay pa tong batang ito nasa edad na 7 years old. So, it becomes harder as a child continues to develop, it becomes harder to find clear links between language and intellect. So, some studies have focused on children who have learned to speak fluently despite abnormal mental development. Syntax in particular does not appear to rely on general intellectual growth. Okay? Ayan. Nako, siguro many of you could relate to that kind of scenario wherein 7-year-old child, ang galing mag-English. I am already a college student. Why is it that kid not even construct a better English? Okay? So, ayan. Yun yung concept ng kay PJ. Si PJ kasi nakatoon yung kanyang pansin doon sa different stages. Stages talaga ang tinitingnan. Okay? Kaya nga lang, yung pagtingin niya doon sa stages na yon, it does not always apply to all. Diba? Again, it's a theory. Input or social interactionist theories. Tingnan naman natin ito. We will be mention again Vygotsky. So Vygotsky's social interaction theory incorporates nurture arguments in that children can be influenced by their environment, okay, as well as the language input children receive from their caregivers. Pagka-behaviorist din itong atake to. Kaya lang, meron siyang iba. Sa kanya is more of social interaction yung focus niya. So, Vygotsky also developed the concept of private speech. Pag-aralan na natin, di ba yan? Sige nga, if you still remember the difference, the private speech and the public, the private speech and the other one is the public speech ata. I think public speech. Anong oli yung private speech? Tinutukoy natin yung iniisip no bata. Okay? So, yung bata, meron siyang sariling thoughts. Okay? Na sinasabi niya sa sarili lang niya. Private speech. Okay? Which is when children must speak to themselves in a self-guiding and directing way, initially out loud, and later internally, and the zone of proximal development, which refers to the task a child is unable to complete alone, but is able to complete with the assistance of an adult. Minsan kasi, yung bata may gusto siyang sabihin, pero kailangan niya ng assistance. Kaya nga, di ba meron tayong tinatawag na when we are always referring to Vygotsky's theory, we are always pertaining to scaffolding, guidance. Kailangan mo magturo sa bata. So, simple lang ang gustong sabihin ni Vygotsky when it comes to language acquisition and language learning. So, kapag ang bata ay nasa isang environment na tinuturuan siya para matututo at matututo talaga siya ng pagsasalita ng specific language. Let's say, for example, maganda yung input. Okay, input is a technical term that we use in language acquisition. Yung things that are used in order for a child to learn, the input. So, kapag maganda yung input sa bata at mahusay yung laging kausap niya, ma-acquire ng bata yan. It's already a form of scaffolding. Or if a child is tutored by someone who's really good at and speaking a specific language, matututo at matututo ang bata. So, yun lang naman yung gustong sabihin ng bata, ng teorya ni Vygotsky. Kapag competent ang nagtuturo sa kanya, ang bata has this possibility na maging competent din. If ang bata ay exposed sa isang environment na kung saan hindi siya tinutulungan, hindi siya tinuturuan, there's a possibility yung bata ay hindi rin matuto unless otherwise ang bata has his or her own way to learn. May sarili siyang kakayanan na iproseso yung mga bagay-bagay. So, interactionists such as Jerome Bruner suggest that the language behavior of adults when talking to children, known by several names, by most easily referred to as child-directed speech, is especially adapted to support the acquisition process. Ito yung kakabanggit ko lang kanina sa inyo na there is still, kasi sa scaffolding, there's a need for someone to guide the child. So this support is often described to us as scaffolding, just like what I mentioned, for the child's language learning. So Bruner also coined the term Language Acquisition Support System, or LASS, in response to Chomsky's language acquisition device. So kung ang language acquisition device is referring to how our brain processes things, then in order for us to learn specific language, si Bruner mentioned tinatawag na language acquisition support system. And this does not only pertain to teka lang, biglang tumawag sa this does not only pertain to someone na may kakayanang magproseso. Instead, it is pertaining to others. When we talk of language acquisition support system, it is pertaining to others who are guiding, who are supporting the child to learn that specific language. Ang language acquisition device, sa'yo lang, ikaw lang mismo, sarili mo lang yun. Ikaw mismo ang magpo-process nun because sabi ni Bruner, may utak ka naman, may kakayanan ka naman umunawa, ikaw magpo-process nun. Okay? Kaya ito yung naging response ni Bruner doon sa LAD ni Chomsky. Colwyn Trevarthen studied the interaction between parents and babies who were too young to speak. He concluded that, ganda ng sinabi niya rito, he concluded that the turn-taking structure of conversation is developed through games and nonverbal communication long before actual words were uttered. So sinasabi naman kasi natin that when we talk of language, we're not only just pertaining to the spoken words. We are actually pertaining to some nonverbal communication. So doon pa lang sinasabi ni Colwyn na this helps the interaction. This helps the child to process things. Okay, with the guidance of the parents. Kasi nga 'di ba, scaffolding, LASS, kailangan mo ng support system. So according to Williamson, children can eventually use their own internal speech to direct their own behavior in much the same way that their parents' speech once directed their behavior. Speech to infants is marked by a slower rate, exaggerated intonation, high-frequency repetition, simple syntax, and concrete vocabulary. This tailored articulation used by caregivers to young children to maximize phonemic contrast and pronunciation of correct forms is known as child-directed speech. So, in short, it only tells us that the same thing that I mentioned to you a while ago, that still the way the parents utilize yung tinatawag nating parents' speech. Once it was directed to the behavior of the child, then the child has this tendency nga to acquire that language. Kumbaga, hindi man ma-express ng bata yon, meron tayong tinatawag na internal speech. Nasa sa loob lang nila yun. Di ba, minsan may you're observing ng child na may gustong sabihin pero hindi nila kayang i-express kasi hindi pa naman talaga fully developed yung kanilang speech. But you can really see from them that they really would like to say something but they could not express it. So, yung ginagawa ng parents to articulate words, it is called the child-directed speech. Yung ginagawa niyong pagtuturo sa mga bata, paano sila magsalita, ang tawag natin ay child-directed speech. Again, meron ding limitations ang social interactionist theory. So this theory or the theory serve as a useful corrective to Chomsky's early position. Parang inaano nila si Chomsky na. This theory serve as a useful corrective to Chomsky's early position. It seems likely that a child will learn more quickly with frequent interaction. The more the child, kasi nga si Chomsky, di ba, okay, matututo rin naman yan eh. Kasi nga, may brain yan na nagpo-process ng kanyang linguistic function. Pero sabi ng mga social interaction is no. Kung gusto talaga nating matuto yung batang yan, there has to be a frequent interaction. Okay, so we have also seen that there are cultures in which adults do not adopt special ways of talking to children. So CDS may be useful but seems not to be essential. Ito nga tama. Diba yung child-directed speech na sabi natin na if you really would like to teach the child, there has to be a child-directed speech. Pero there are cultures who are not into that kind of way of teaching the child. Kasi nga, iba yung kanilang pinaniniwalaan. Matututo naman yung bata yan eh, paglaki niyan. May mga ganun. But social interactionist theories could not suffice that. Why is it that even if this child is not being taught by someone, natuto naman? Now, how social interactionist theory can explain that? Kung sinasabi nila that there has to be child-directed speech. Pero may mga bata na natututo kahit hindi mo sila bibigyan ng kahit hindi mo sila tinuturuan. Okay? Now, can social interactions theory explain that? Okay. So, yun yung mga limitation niya. Okay? So, that's it for today. So, you have filled in again your bean with Sir Batch Learning It. Okay, so thank you very much.